The 42nd floor of Sterling Industries was where careers went to die. Ramsay Sterling, the ice-cold CEO who'd fired 3 department heads before lunch, ruled his empire with an iron fist that had never shown mercy. But when he stepped into the empty cafeteria at midnight, searching for the financial reports he'd left behind, he froze. There, hunched over a trash bin, was Elin, 7 months pregnant and carefully picking through discarded sandwiches like they were treasure. The woman who'd been his assistant for 2 years, who smiled politely every morning while hiding this devastating secret. What Ramsay did next sent shockwaves through the entire company. Because this wasn't just about a struggling employee, this was about a past he'd buried, a promise he'd broken, and a truth that could unravel everything he'd built. The most feared man in the city was about to become someone entirely different. But why would a billionaire CEO risk his reputation for one pregnant woman? What was Ellen hiding that made her too proud to ask for help? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead, casting harsh shadows across the empty cafeteria. Ramsay's Italian leather shoes echoed against the polished floor as he stood motionless, watching Ellen's trembling hands carefully unwrap a half-eaten turkey sandwich. Her blonde hair, usually pulled back in a neat bun, hung loose around her face like a curtain of shame. She was wearing the same navy dress she'd worn 3 times this week. He'd noticed, though he'd never admit it. Just as he'd noticed the way she'd started declining lunch invitations with other assistants, claiming she preferred to eat at her desk. Now he understood why. "Ellen!" His voice cut through the silence like a blade. She spun around so quickly that her rounded belly knocked against the trash bin, sending it clattering across the floor. The sandwich fell from her hands, landing on the cold tile. Her dark eyes were wide with terror, like a deer caught in headlights. "Mr. Sterling, I was just—" She scrambled to pick up the fallen food, her movements clumsy and desperate. "Stop." The command was quiet but absolute. "Don't touch that." She froze, still crouched on the floor, her face flushed crimson. Tears gathered in her eyes, threatening to spill over. "Please don't fire me. I know this looks terrible, but I can explain." "Can you?" Ramsay's voice was dangerously soft. "Can you explain why my assistant, who earns $55,000 a year, is eating garbage at midnight?" Ellen struggled to her feet, one hand pressed against her lower back. The baby had dropped lower in recent weeks, making every movement an effort. "It's not what you think." "Then enlighten me." She wrapped her arms around her swollen belly protectively. "I made some poor financial decisions. Medical bills mostly. The baby's father—" She swallowed hard. "He left when he found out about the pregnancy. I'm managing fine, really. I just needed to save money on food for a few more weeks until—" "Medical bills?" Something sharp twisted in Ramsay's chest. "What kind of medical bills?" "Complications early in the pregnancy. I had to take unpaid leave, and my insurance didn't cover everything." Her voice grew smaller with each word. "I fell behind on rent, utilities. But I'm catching up. I don't need charity, Mr. Sterling. I just need this job." Ramsay stared at her, his mind racing. Ellen Matthews, 26 years old, originally from Portland, no family in New York. He knew these facts from her personnel file, but he'd never truly seen her until this moment. Never noticed how thin her face had become despite her pregnancy, or how she'd started wearing the same 3 outfits in rotation. "You've been hungry for how long?" The question came out harsher than he intended. She flinched. I'm not starving. I eat. I just have to be creative sometimes." "Creative." He repeated the word like it left a bitter taste. "You call this creative?" "I call it surviving." For the first time, steel entered her voice. "Some of us don't have the luxury of choice, Mr. Sterling. When you're responsible for another life, you do whatever it takes." The words hit him like a physical blow. Images flashed through his mind. Another young woman, another pregnancy, another time he'd been too proud, too focused on building his empire to notice someone drowning right in front of him. Margaret. Her name whispered through his consciousness like a ghost. "Sir?" Ellen's voice seemed to come from far away. "Are you all right?" Ramsay blinked, returning to the present. Ellen was watching him with concern despite her own desperate situation, always thinking of others even when she had nothing left to give, just like Margaret had. "Pack your things," he said abruptly. The color drained from her face. "Mr. Sterling, please, you're coming with me." "I don't understand." Ramsay pulled out his phone, scrolling through his contacts. "We're going to fix this, all of it, starting now. I told you, I don't need—" "You're wrong, Ellen." He looked up from his phone, and for just a moment, his carefully constructed mask slipped. "You need help, and I need to give it to you." Something in his tone made her step back. "Why?" The question hung between them like a challenge. Why indeed? Because seeing her like this tore open old wounds he'd thought had healed. Because he'd failed someone else once, and the guilt had eaten at him for years. Or because, if he was honest with himself, Elin Matthews had become far more than just his assistant. The elevator ride to the executive floor stretched like an eternity. Ellen pressed herself against the polished steel wall, acutely aware of Ramsay's imposing presence beside her. His cologne, expensive, woodsy, mixed with the lingering smell of kitchen grease that clung to her uniform, creating a stark reminder of the chasm between their worlds. She stole a glance at his reflection in the elevator doors. His jaw was set in that familiar hard line she'd observed from across crowded boardrooms, but something flickered in his dark eyes, something that made her stomach twist with more than just hunger. "Sir, I really should get back to—" "You'll go where I tell you to go." His voice cut through her protest like a blade, but without the venom she expected. "When did you last see a doctor?" The question caught her off guard. What? For the pregnancy." His eyes dropped briefly to her midsection, hidden beneath the loose-fitting kitchen uniform. "When?" Heat flooded her cheeks. "That's not really your concern, Mr. Ramsay." The elevator chimed softly as they reached the 42nd floor. The doors opened to reveal a world Elin had only glimpsed through security footage. Marble floors, floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city, and an atmosphere that reeked of power and money. Ramsay's hand found the small of her back, guiding her forward. The touch burned through the thin fabric of her uniform, and she jerked away instinctively. "Don't!" The word escaped before she could stop it. He froze, his hands suspended in the air between them. For a moment, something vulnerable crossed his features, so quick she almost missed it. Then the mask slammed back into place. "My office. Now." His corner office was a monument to success. Awards lined the shelves, expensive artwork adorned the walls, and through the massive windows the city sprawled below like a kingdom awaiting orders. Elin had cleaned these offices before, always under cover of darkness when the executives were long gone. Being here now, with him watching her every move, felt surreal. "Sit." He gestured to one of the leather chairs facing his desk. "I'd rather stand." It wasn't a request. She remained standing anyway, chin lifted in defiance that surprised them both. Ramsay studied her for a long moment, then moved to a small refrigerator hidden behind a wooden panel. He withdrew a bottle of water and a container of what looked like leftover salad. "Eat." "Mr. Ramsay, how far along?" The question hung between them like a loaded weapon. Ellen's hand moved unconsciously to her stomach, and she saw his eyes track the movement. 4 months, she whispered. Something shifted in his expression. He set the food on the coffee table and stepped back, as if proximity to her was dangerous. "The father? Gone." The word tasted bitter. "Has been since he found out." Ramsay's hands clenched into fists at his sides. "Name." "Why?" She laughed, but there was no humor in it. "Going to have him fired too? He doesn't work here. He's just gone." "I'm not firing you." The words hit her like a physical blow. "What? You heard me." "But you said—" "I said a lot of things." He moved to the window, presenting his back to her. Most of them were lies. The admission hung in the air between them, heavy with implications she didn't dare examine. Aylin sank into the chair she'd refused moments earlier, her legs suddenly unsteady. "I don't understand." "Neither do I." His reflection in the window looked haunted. "Eat the food, Ellen." The use of her first name sent a shock through her system. She'd worked for his company for 2 years, and he'd never once acknowledged her existence directly, let alone spoken her name. "How do you know my name?" His shoulders tensed. "I know all my employees' names." "No, you don't." She stood again, anger giving her strength. "You barely look at us. We're invisible to you. So, how do you know mine?" When he turned back to her, the raw pain in his eyes nearly knocked her backward. It was the look of a man carrying secrets that were slowly destroying him from the inside out. "Because," he said quietly, "you have my eyes." The world tilted sideways. Ellen gripped the back of the chair, her knuckles white against the dark leather. The room seemed to contract around them, the air growing thick and unbreathable. "That's impossible." "Is it?" He took a step toward her, and she could see it now, the similarities she'd unconsciously noticed but never allowed herself to acknowledge. The shape of their eyes, the stubborn set of their chins, the way they both tilted their heads when thinking. "No." She shook her head violently. "No, that's not. My father is dead. He died when I was 3. Your father," Ramsay said carefully, "is standing right in front of you." The words shattered something fundamental inside her chest. 25 years of carefully constructed reality crumbled in an instant, leaving her drowning in a truth too devastating to accept. The elevator ride to the 42nd floor felt eternal. Ellen pressed herself against the corner, acutely aware of Ramsay's presence beside her, the subtle scent of his cologne, the way he stood perfectly still, except for the occasional tap of his fingers against his thigh. She caught herself studying his reflection in the polished steel doors, noting how his jaw remained rigid, his eyes fixed straight ahead. When the doors finally opened, she expected him to lead her to his office. Instead, he turned left toward the executive conference room, the one with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city. Her stomach dropped. This was where terminations happened, where careers went to die. "Sit," he said, gesturing to the chair at the head of the massive mahogany table. He remained standing, hands clasped behind his back as he moved to the windows. The silence stretched between them like a taut wire. Ellen's hands trembled as she folded them in her lap, trying to make herself as small as possible in the oversized leather chair. Through the glass, she could see storm clouds gathering over the harbor, matching the tension in the room. "How long?" His voice cut through the quiet without warning. "I don't. How long have you been?" He turned, and she was surprised to see something other than anger in his expression. Concern? No, that was impossible. Struggling. The word hung in the air like an accusation. Ellen felt heat rise in her cheeks, shame washing over her in waves. She wanted to lie, to preserve what little dignity she had left, but what was the point now? "Since my roommate moved out 6 weeks ago," she whispered, "I couldn't make rent alone, and finding someone new." She touched her still flat stomach unconsciously. "It's complicated." Ramsay's gaze followed the movement of her hand, and something shifted in his features. He moved closer, his footsteps muffled by the thick carpet. "The father? Gone." The word came out sharper than she intended. He made it very clear that this wasn't part of his 5-year plan. "And your family?" Ellen let out a bitter laugh. "My family disowned me the day I dropped out of law school to take this job. They had very specific expectations about what my life should look like." She watched as Ramsay processed this information, his expression unreadable. He pulled out his phone and typed rapidly, his thumbs moving with practiced efficiency. "What are you doing?" "Fixing this." He didn't look up from the screen. "There's an apartment in Harbor Towers. Furnished, utilities included. You'll move in today." Ellen shot to her feet, the chair rolling backward. "I can't accept that. I won't be anyone's charity case." "It's not charity." His tone was matter-of-fact, businesslike, Consider it a company benefit. We can't have our employees collapsing from malnutrition. It's bad for productivity. You don't understand. I understand perfectly. He finally looked at her, and for a moment she thought she saw something raw in his eyes before he shuttered it away. You're proud. You'd rather starve than accept help, but pride doesn't feed a baby. The words hit her like a physical blow. She sank back into the chair, overwhelmed by the sudden shift in her circumstances. This morning she'd been invisible, desperate, picking through garbage for sustenance. Now the most powerful man in the company was offering to house her. Why? The question escaped before she could stop it. Why are you helping me? Ramsay was quiet for so long she wondered if he'd heard her. When he finally spoke, his voice was different, softer, more vulnerable than she'd ever heard it. Because I know what it's like to be hungry. He moved to the window again, his back to her, to count every penny, to choose between dignity and survival. Ellen stared at his profile, seeing him clearly for the first time. Beneath the expensive suit and commanding presence was something she recognized, the careful composure of someone who'd learned early that showing weakness was dangerous. I don't believe you. He smiled then, but it wasn't pleasant. My mother cleaned offices at night to keep us fed. I wore the same 3 shirts to school for 2 years because they were all we could afford. I know exactly what desperation tastes like, Miss Chen. The revelation hung between them, creating an unexpected bridge across the vast gulf of their circumstances. Ellen felt something shift inside her chest, a crack in the wall she'd built around her heart. The apartment comes with one condition, Ramsay continued, his business mask sliding back into place. You'll report directly to me from now on. I want daily updates on your progress, your health, everything. That's not necessary. It's non-negotiable. His eyes met hers, and she saw steel beneath the surface. You wanted to know why I'm helping you? Because I can, because no one helped me, and I remember exactly how that felt. The silence in Ramsay's office stretched like a taut wire ready to snap. Ellen stood frozen by the door, her hand still gripping the handle as if it were her lifeline back to the safety of anonymity. The mahogany desk between them felt like an ocean, yet somehow Ramsay's presence filled every corner of the room, making the air thick and difficult to breathe. Sit, he said again, his voice carrying that particular tone she'd heard him use in board meetings, the one that made seasoned executives scramble to comply. But Ellen wasn't a seasoned executive. She was a woman with nothing left to lose, and that made her dangerous in ways Ramsay hadn't anticipated. I prefer to stand. Her chin lifted slightly, a gesture that reminded him so strongly of someone else that his breath caught. Ramsay moved around the desk, each step deliberate and measured. When he stopped 3 feet away from her, Ellen caught the scent of his cologne, something expensive and understated that probably cost more than her monthly salary. The proximity made her acutely aware of how she must look, how she must smell after her humiliating encounter with the garbage bin. How far along? The question came out softer than he'd intended. Ellen's hand moved instinctively to her stomach, then stopped halfway, as if she could take back the telltale gesture. I don't see how that's any of your business. Everything that happens in my company is my business. His grey eyes studied her face with an intensity that made her want to look away, especially when it involves employees struggling. The word struggling hung between them like an accusation. Ellen felt heat flood her cheeks. I'm managing just fine. Eating garbage is your definition of managing? The blunt statement hit her like a physical blow. She'd hoped, somehow, that he'd pretend not to have seen what he'd clearly witnessed, that they could maintain the fiction that she hadn't completely humiliated herself. It wasn't garbage, she said quietly. It was perfectly good food that someone threw away. There's a difference. Ramsay's jaw tightened. Not to me. Before Ellen could respond, he moved to his desk and pulled out his phone. His fingers flew across the screen with practiced efficiency. What are you doing? Alarm crept into her voice. Arranging for a meal to be brought up. No. The word came out sharp and panicked. I can't afford to owe you anything. Ramsey's hand stilled on his phone. Something flickered across his face, an emotion too quick to identify. Who said anything about owing? Men like you don't do anything without expecting something in return. The accusation hit its mark. Ramsey's expression hardened, but underneath the familiar mask of corporate authority, Elin glimpsed something that looked almost like hurt. Men like me, he repeated slowly. And what exactly do you think you know about men like me? Ellen's heart hammered against her ribs. She was treading dangerous ground, but exhaustion and desperation had stripped away her usual filters. I know you have everything handed to you on silver platters, while people like me fight for scraps. I know you've never had to choose between paying rent and buying groceries. I know you think throwing money at a problem makes it disappear. Each word seemed to strike him physically. By the time she finished, his face had gone completely blank, a look she recognized from the gossip magazines that occasionally featured him. It was his corporate shark expression, the one that preceded hostile takeovers and brutal firings. But then something unexpected happened. Instead of exploding with anger or coldly dismissing her, Ramsey sank into the chair behind his desk as if her words had drained all the fight out of him. You're right, he said quietly. About most of it. The admission caught Elin completely off guard. She'd braced herself for retaliation, not vulnerability. But you're wrong about one thing. His grey eyes met hers, and for a moment, the powerful CEO facade cracked entirely. I know exactly what it feels like to be hungry. I know what it's like to have nothing, to be nothing. I've been there, Ellen. Longer than you might think. The use of her first name sent an unexpected shiver down her spine. In all her months at the company, she'd never heard him address any employee by their given name. I don't understand. Ramsey stood slowly, moving to the window that overlooked the city. His reflection in the glass looked haunted. 25 years ago, I was a different person entirely. Different name, different life. I made choices, did things. He paused, his shoulders tensing. Things that could destroy everything I've built if they ever came to light. Ellen found herself taking a step closer, drawn by the raw honesty in his voice. Why are you telling me this? Ramsey turned from the window, and when his eyes met hers, she saw something that made her breath catch. Recognition. Not just of her as an employee, but as someone who mattered. Someone who understood what it meant to survive. Because, he said softly, I think we might need each other more than either of us wants to admit. The elevator's ascent felt interminable, each floor marker a countdown to something Ellen couldn't name. Ramsey stood beside her, his presence filling the small space like smoke, invasive and inescapable. She caught her reflection in the polished steel doors, hollow cheeks, dark circles beneath her eyes, the cheap fabric of her blouse wrinkled from another sleepless night on Maya's lumpy couch. Next to him, she looked like exactly what she was, desperate. You don't have to do this, she said quietly, her voice barely audible over the elevator's mechanical hum. His jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. Do what? Whatever this is. The food, She gestured vaguely between them. I don't need your pity. The elevator chimed softly as they reached the executive floor. When the doors slid open, Ramsey's hand found the small of her back, guiding her forward with a touch that seemed to burn through the thin cotton of her shirt. It's not pity. His office sprawled before them like a monument to power, floor-to-ceiling windows offering a commanding view of the city, leather furniture that probably cost more than she'd made in the past year, awards and accolades arranged with calculated precision. But it was the small details that caught her attention. A coffee cup with lipstick stains abandoned on the massive desk, a framed photograph face down beside it, prescription bottles half hidden behind a stack of reports. Sit, Ramsey said, moving toward a concealed refrigerator built into the wall paneling. When did you last have a proper meal? Ellen remained standing, her arms wrapped protectively around her still flat stomach. Mr. Ramsey, I appreciate whatever this is, but 3 days ago? 4? He pulled items from the refrigerator with practiced efficiency, fresh fruit, artisanal cheese, what looked like expensive deli meat. You're pregnant. Your baby needs nutrients, not garbage. The word baby hung between them like a live wire. Ellen sank into the offered chair, suddenly exhausted by the weight of maintaining her facade. How did you know? The way you've been clutching your stomach. The fact that you haven't touched coffee in weeks. I notice these things. He arranged the food on a pristine white plate, his movements surprisingly gentle for hands that had built an empire. The morning sickness is why you were in that bathroom, wasn't it? She nodded, accepting the plate with trembling fingers. The cheese was soft and creamy, nothing like the processed slices she'd been rationing for days. The first bite nearly brought tears to her eyes. The father. Ramsey's voice was carefully neutral, but something flickered behind his eyes. Gone. The word came out harder than she'd intended. He made his priorities clear when I told him. Ramsey moved to the windows, his silhouette dark against the afternoon sky. And your family? A bitter laugh escaped her. My parents made their feelings about my life choices very clear a long time ago. As for financial support, she took another bite, savoring the simple pleasure of food that hadn't been discarded. Let's just say I've learned not to rely on anyone but myself. That's a lonely way to live. Something in his tone made her look up sharply. His reflection in the window seemed haunted, older somehow than the man who'd terrified her in boardroom meetings. You sound like you speak from experience. He turned then, and for a moment his carefully constructed mask slipped. She saw something raw underneath, a pain that mirrored her own. Everyone has secrets, Ellen. Everyone has things they'd rather forget. The use of her first name sent an unexpected shiver down her spine. She'd been Ms. Carter in meetings, a faceless employee among hundreds. This intimacy felt dangerous. What secrets could someone like you possibly have? The question escaped before she could stop it. Ramsey's laugh was sharp, humorless. Someone like me? He moved closer, and she caught the faint scent of his cologne mixed with something else, exhaustion, perhaps, or desperation disguised as control. You think power insulates you from loss, from guilt? His phone buzzed insistently on the desk. The moment shattered as he glanced at the screen, his face hardening back into its familiar mask of authority. I have a meeting in 10 minutes. Ellen set down the plate, the food suddenly tasteless. Of course. I should get back to... You're taking the rest of the day off. He scrawled something on company letterhead, handed it to her. Paid leave. Consider it a medical necessity. Sir, I can't accept. You can, and you will. His voice brooked no argument, but underneath the command was something that sounded almost like pleading. And Aylin? This stays between us. She stood, clutching the paper like a lifeline. At the door she paused. Why are you helping me? Ramsey had moved to the overturned photograph on his desk, his fingers hovering over the frame without lifting it. Because sometimes, he said quietly, we all need someone to catch us when we fall. The elevator ride to the executive floor felt endless. Ellen pressed herself against the back wall, acutely aware of how out of place she looked in her worn cardigan and scuffed shoes. Ramsey stood beside her in silence, his presence both protective and unsettling. She could smell his cologne, something expensive and sharp that made her dizzy. When the doors opened, she stepped into a world of polished marble and floor-to-ceiling windows that offered a breathtaking view of the city. Everything here spoke of power and money, from the abstract paintings on the walls to the receptionist's designer dress. Ellen had never been above the third floor, and now she understood why people spoke of the executive level in hushed tones. This way. Ramsey's voice was gentle, almost careful, as if she might bolt at any moment. He guided her down a hallway lined with offices, past assistants who looked up with barely concealed curiosity. Their whispers would start before she even reached his office, she knew. By tomorrow, rumors would be flying through every department. His office was enormous, with a sitting area that probably cost more than her annual salary. But it was the view that took her breath away. The entire city sprawled below them like a glittering map. Ramsey closed the door and moved to a small kitchenette she hadn't noticed before. Sit, he said, gesturing to the leather sofa. Please. Ellen perched on the edge, afraid to lean back into the expensive upholstery. She watched as he moved around the kitchenette with surprising familiarity, pulling items from a well-stocked refrigerator. His movements were efficient, practiced, as if he'd done this before. "You don't have to." "Yes, I do." His tone brooked no argument, but there was something vulnerable in it that made her chest tighten. "Turkey sandwich, okay? I have some soup I can heat up too." She nodded, not trusting her voice. This felt surreal, like stepping into someone else's life. CEOs didn't make sandwiches for lowly data entry clerks. They certainly didn't invite them into their private offices and treat them with this strange, careful kindness. While he worked, she studied his profile. Without the harsh boardroom lighting, he looked younger somehow. There were lines around his eyes that spoke of long nights and heavy responsibilities, but also something else, a sadness that seemed bone deep. When he glanced up and caught her staring, she looked away quickly. "How long?" he asked quietly, not turning around. "What? How long since you've had a proper meal?" The question hung in the air between them. Ellen considered lying, maintaining what little dignity she had left. But something in his voice, that careful neutrality that didn't quite hide the concern beneath, made honesty easier than deception. 3 days, she whispered. "Maybe 4. I lose track sometimes." His hands stilled on the sandwich. She saw his shoulders tense, and when he turned around, his expression was carefully controlled. But his eyes burned with something that might have been rage or grief or both. "The baby is fine," she said quickly. "I made sure the baby was fine first. I take prenatal vitamins. I eat when I can. I wouldn't hurt. I know." He set the plate in front of her, and she noticed his hands were shaking slightly. "I know you wouldn't." There was something in the way he said it, a certainty that went beyond logic. How could he know anything about her? They'd barely spoken before today, yet he looked at her as if she mattered, as if her pain was somehow his own. The sandwich was perfect, thick slices of turkey, fresh lettuce, real butter. She forced herself to eat slowly, to savor each bite instead of wolfing it down like the starving woman she was. He sat across from her, not eating, just watching with that same intense focus he brought to board meetings. "Why are you doing this?" she asked between bites. For a long moment, he didn't answer. He leaned back in his chair, his gaze drifting to the window and the city beyond. When he finally spoke, his voice was so quiet she almost missed it. "Because someone should have done it for her." "Her?" His jaw tightened. "It doesn't matter. Ancient history." But it did matter. She could see that much. Whatever had happened, whoever she was, it had left scars that ran deep. The revelation should have felt intimate, this glimpse behind his carefully constructed facade. Instead, it made her afraid. Powerful men didn't share their pain with employees unless they had reasons that went beyond simple kindness. "Mr. Ramsey." "David." The correction was sharp, almost desperate. "When it's just us, call me David." The request sent warning bells through her head. This was dangerous territory, this strange intimacy growing between them. But when she looked into his eyes and saw the raw need there, she found herself nodding. "David," she said softly, and watched something break apart behind his carefully guarded expression. The silence in Ramsey's office stretched like a taut wire, ready to snap. Ellen sat rigid in the leather chair, her hands protectively cradled over her stomach, while Ramsey stood at the floor-to-ceiling windows, his reflection ghost-like against the city lights below. "You can't just ignore what happened," she whispered, her voice barely audible above the hum of the air conditioning. Ramsey's shoulders tensed, but he didn't turn around. "I'm not ignoring anything. I'm protecting you." "From what?" "The truth?" Ellen's voice cracked with frustration. "You think I don't know who you are? You think I haven't wondered why you look exactly like—" "Don't." The word came out sharp as a blade. Ramsey finally turned, his grey eyes blazing with warning. "Don't say his name." But Ellen was past caring about his warnings. The months of struggling, of hiding, of pretending she was fine, while her world crumbled around her, had stripped away her filter. "Michael Garrett, your brother." The man who got me pregnant and disappeared without a trace. The name hung in the air like poison. Ramsey's face went ashen, and for a moment, the powerful CEO facade cracked, revealing something raw and wounded beneath. "He's not my brother," Ramsey said quietly, each word deliberate and cold. "Not anymore." Ellen stared at him. Pieces of a puzzle she'd been trying to solve for months finally clicking into place. The way Ramsey had looked at her that first day she'd started working at Morrison Industries, like he'd seen a ghost. The occasional flicker of recognition in his eyes when he thought she wasn't looking. The strange tension that seemed to follow her wherever she went in the building. "You knew," she breathed. "You knew who I was when you hired me." Ramsey moved to his desk, his movements controlled, somehow predatory. He pulled out a thick manila folder and dropped it in front of her with a heavy thud. Ellen Catherine Morrison, 26 years old, graduated summa cum laude from Northwestern with a degree in marketing, previous employment at 3 different agencies before joining us 6 months ago. Her blood turned to ice. "How do you—" "I know everything about you." His voice was devoid of emotion now, businesslike and terrifying. "I know you met Michael at that conference in Chicago. I know you dated for 3 months. I know he told you he was a freelance consultant and never mentioned his real name was Michael Ramsey." Ellen felt the room spinning around her. "Ramsey? But you said he wasn't your brother." "He's not. Not legally." Ramsey's jaw clenched. "I had his name changed years ago, along with his trust fund access. Cut him off completely." "Why?" The question seemed to physically pain him. Ramsey sank into his chair, suddenly looking older than his 34 years. "Because Michael is poison. Everything he touches turns to ash. Everyone he claims to love ends up destroyed." "He said he loved me," Ellen whispered. "He says that to everyone. Right before he steals their money, breaks their heart, or worse." Ramsey's eyes met hers, and she saw something she'd never expected from him. Vulnerability. "I've been cleaning up his messes my entire life. But when I found out about you, about the baby, you what? Decided to play God with my life? I decided to break the cycle." He leaned forward, his voice intense. "Do you think it's a coincidence that you got a job here when you were barely qualified? That your salary is higher than industry standard? That your medical insurance covers everything?" The truth hit her like a physical blow. "You've been taking care of me. I've been trying to fix what he broke, like I always do." Ellen stood abruptly, her chair scraping against the floor. "I don't need you to fix anything. I don't need your guilt money or your pity job." "This isn't pity." Ramsey was on his feet too now, moving around the desk toward her. "That child you're carrying is my blood, my responsibility." "Your responsibility?" Her voice rose dangerously. "That baby is mine. Mine and Michael's. You don't get to claim ownership because you share DNA. Michael doesn't even know you're pregnant." The words stopped her cold. "What?" "He doesn't know. I made sure of that." Ramsey's expression was unreadable. "When I found out about you, I tracked him down. Made him disappear before he could do more damage." The room tilted. Ellen grabbed the edge of the desk for support. "Made him disappear? What does that mean?" "It means he's gone, Ellen. He can't hurt you anymore." "Where is he?" Her voice was barely a whisper now, terror creeping up her spine. Ramsey's silence was answer enough. "Oh God." She backed toward the door, one hand pressed against her mouth. "What did you do?" "What I had to do. What I should have done years ago." The door seemed impossibly far away. Ellen's heart hammered against her ribs as the full magnitude of her situation crashed over her. She wasn't just tangled up with Ramsey Corporation's ruthless CEO, she was carrying the child of a man who might be dead, protected by a man who might have killed him. The rain hammered against the floor-to-ceiling windows of Ramsey's penthouse office as he stared at the DNA test results for the 3rd time. The paper trembled slightly in his hands, though he'd never admit such weakness to anyone. 24 hours had passed since he'd received the confirmation that changed everything. Ellen Matthews was his half-sister. The irony wasn't lost on him. For weeks, he'd been drawn to her in ways that both confused and infuriated him. The protective instinct that had driven him to that cafeteria dumpster, the inexplicable need to ensure her well-being, it all made sickening sense now. His subconscious had recognized what his mind refused to acknowledge. A soft knock interrupted his spiraling thoughts. "Come in," he called, quickly sliding the papers into his desk drawer. Marcus entered, his usual composed demeanor intact. "The car is ready for the hospital visit, sir. Miss Matthews is expecting you at 2 o'clock. Cancel it." The words left Ramsey's mouth before he could stop them. Marcus raised an eyebrow. "Sir, you've been quite insistent about monitoring her prenatal appointments." Ramsey stood abruptly, turning toward the window. How could he explain that, sitting in that sterile waiting room, pretending to be a concerned employer while knowing the truth about their blood connection? Felt like a betrayal of everything? "I have more pressing matters to attend to." "Of course, sir. Should I reschedule?" "No." Ramsey's reflection stared back at him from the rain-streaked glass, and for a moment he saw traces of his father's face, the same sharp jawline that Ellen possessed. Tell her the company will continue covering her medical expenses, but my direct involvement is no longer necessary." The silence stretched until Marcus cleared his throat. "Sir, if I may speak frankly." Ramsey's shoulders tensed. Marcus had been with the family for over a decade. He'd seen too much to be easily fooled. "What is it?" "Miss Matthews seemed quite relieved to have your support." "Whatever's changed, perhaps." "Nothing's changed." The lie tasted bitter. Everything had changed. "She's an employee receiving standard benefits, that's all." After Marcus left, Ramsey returned to his desk and retrieved the DNA report. The scientific certainty mocked him. 99.97% probability of half-sibling relationship. He thought of his father, James Blackwood, a man whose appetites had always exceeded his moral boundaries. How many other secrets had died with him 5 years ago? His phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. "Mr. Blackwood, this is Ellen. Marcus said you couldn't make the appointment. I wanted to thank you again for everything. The baby and I are doing well." The baby. Another complication in an already impossible situation. His niece or nephew, growing inside his half-sister, who had no idea that the man she viewed as her salvation was actually family. Family she'd never known existed. Ramsey's finger hovered over the keyboard. He wanted to respond, to maintain the connection that had somehow become vital to his daily routine. Instead, he deleted the message thread and blocked the number. The afternoon passed in a haze of meetings and conference calls, but his mind kept drifting to the medical appointment happening across town. Was she alone in that sterile room? Did she wonder why he'd suddenly withdrawn his support? The questions gnawed at him with an intensity that surprised him. By evening, Ramsey found himself in his private study at home, surrounded by photo albums he hadn't opened in years. There, buried in a collection from his childhood, he found what he was looking for, a picture of his father at a company Christmas party, his arm around a young woman with dark hair and familiar green eyes. Catherine Matthews, Ellen's mother. The timestamp on the photo coincided with Ellen's birth year. Ramsey remembered that party vaguely. He'd been 14 and more interested in avoiding his father's business associates than paying attention to the staff. But the woman's face, now that he knew what to look for, held an unmistakable resemblance to Ellen. His phone rang, jarring him from his investigation. The caller ID showed his company's security number. Blackwood. "Sir, we have a situation. Miss Matthews collapsed in the parking garage about an hour ago. She's been taken to St. Mary's Hospital." The photo slipped from Ramsey's fingers. "What happened?" "Witnesses say she appeared dizzy and disoriented. The paramedics mentioned possible dehydration and stress." Ramsey was already reaching for his keys. "I'm on my way." "Sir, should I alert her emergency contacts?" The question stopped him cold. He was her emergency contact. The form sat in his desk drawer, filled out in her careful handwriting weeks ago, but now rushing to her bedside felt like crossing a line he'd tried desperately to maintain. "No," he said finally. "I'll handle this personally." As he drove through the rain-soaked streets toward the hospital, Ramsey realized that some truths were too heavy to bear alone, but too dangerous to share. The woman lying in that hospital bed was both his greatest responsibility and his most devastating secret. The rain hammered against the floor-to-ceiling windows of Ramsey's penthouse as Ellen stood frozen in his doorway, still clutching the envelope containing her resignation letter. The opulent space stretched before her, all marble and steel, a testament to the empire he'd built from nothing. But tonight it felt like a mausoleum. "You can't just disappear," Ramsey said, his voice barely above a whisper. He hadn't moved from where he stood near the fireplace, his usually perfect composure cracked like fractured glass. "Not when I've finally found you." Ellen's hand instinctively moved to her stomach, where their child grew beneath her oversized sweater. The irony wasn't lost on her. She'd spent 5 years hiding from a past that had somehow found its way back through the very walls she'd built around herself. "You don't understand," she began, but he cut her off with a harsh laugh. "Don't understand? Ellen, I've been searching for any trace of the Morrison family for years. When that bastard embezzled everything from my father's company and disappeared, he took more than money. He destroyed lives. My father never recovered from the betrayal." The name hit her like a physical blow. Morrison, her stepfather's name, the one she'd abandoned along with everything else when she'd legally changed her identity at 18. She'd been Elena Morrison then, just a frightened girl whose mother had married a monster. "David Morrison wasn't my father," she said quietly, stepping into the room despite every instinct screaming at her to run. "He was my stepfather, and whatever he did to your family, I had nothing to do with it." Ramsey's eyes narrowed, studying her face in the flickering firelight. "You were there, in the house. I saw you that night when I confronted him about the missing funds. You were maybe 16, 17, standing at the top of the stairs in a blue nightgown." The memory crashed over her like ice water. That terrible night when everything unraveled, when the man her mother had trusted revealed his true nature. She remembered the shouting, the accusations, the way her mother had sobbed when the extent of David's crimes became clear. "I remember you," she whispered, her resignation letter slipping from nerveless fingers to flutter to the marble floor. "You were older than me, wearing a suit even though it was past midnight. You called him a thief, because he was." Ramsey's voice carried years of suppressed rage. "He stole $3 million from Morrison Blackwell Industries. My father's life work. We lost everything, the company, our home, my father's reputation. He died 2 years later, still believing he'd failed as a businessman because he trusted the wrong partner." Ellen closed her eyes, feeling the weight of inherited guilt settle on her shoulders like a familiar coat. "David disappeared 3 days after you came to the house. He took what money was left and vanished. My mother and I never saw him again. Convenient timing." "We had nothing." The words exploded from her, years of buried pain breaking free. "My mother worked 3 jobs trying to pay back what he'd stolen. She died exhausted and broken when I was 22, still sending every spare penny to the victims of his crimes. I've been living under an assumed name because I was terrified someone would connect me to him and assume I was complicit." Ramsey's expression shifted, confusion replacing certainty. "You changed your name?" "Elena Morrison died the day I turned 18. Ellen Carter was born because I couldn't bear carrying the weight of his crimes anymore." She wrapped her arms around herself, suddenly cold despite the warmth of the room. "But apparently you can't outrun the past. It finds you anyway." The silence stretched between them, heavy with revelation and regret. Outside, lightning illuminated the city skyline, casting stark shadows across Ramsey's face. When he spoke again, his voice had lost its edge. "The woman who called herself Morrison's wife, she sent payments? Every month for 7 years, until cancer took her." Ellen's voice broke on the last words. She felt responsible for not seeing what kind of man he really was. "I tried to continue the payments after she died, but working minimum-wage jobs while putting myself through night school." She gestured helplessly. "I could barely survive, let alone repay a debt that wasn't mine to begin with." Ramsey moved then, crossing the space between them with predatory grace. But when he reached her, his hands were gentle as they framed her face, his thumbs brushing away tears she hadn't realized were falling. "My God," he breathed, "what have we done to each other?" The question hung in the air like a prayer and a curse combined. Here they stood, the son of the man destroyed by her stepfather's greed, and the daughter of the woman who died trying to make amends for crimes she'd never committed. Their child, conceived in passion and growing in her womb, represented either salvation or the final tragedy in a story that had begun long before either of them understood the stakes. "What happens now?" she whispered against his palm. The rain hammered against the penthouse windows as Ellen paced the marble floor, her bare feet silent against the cold stone. 3 days had passed since Ramsey's revelation about Marcus, and the weight of his words had settled into her bones like winter frost. She pressed her palm against the glass, watching the city blur through cascading droplets. "You're going to wear a groove in that floor." She turned to find Ramsey standing in the doorway, still wearing yesterday's shirt, wrinkled and untucked. Dark circles shadowed his eyes, and his usually perfect hair fell across his forehead in disheveled waves. He looked human, vulnerable, in a way that made her chest tighten. "Couldn't sleep either?" she asked. He shook his head, moving toward her with careful steps, as if she might bolt at any sudden movement. "Every time I close my eyes, I see his face. Marcus. The way he looked at me when I refused to help him. Tell me about him," Aylin said softly. "Really tell me, not just the facts." Ramsey stopped beside her at the window, their reflections ghost-like in the rain-streaked glass. "He was everything I wasn't. Brave, honest, idealistic. He believed people were fundamentally good, that the system could be changed from within." His voice cracked slightly. "I was so jealous of that certainty." Ellen reached for his hand, finding it cold and trembling. "You loved him, more than I've ever loved anyone." The admission seemed to cost him everything. "When he came to me with evidence about my father's company, the illegal dumping, the cover-ups, I knew helping him would destroy everything I'd worked for, but refusing would destroy him instead. I chose my inheritance over his life, over our future together." Ramsey's reflection in the window looked haunted. 6 months later, he was dead. Car accident, they said. Brake failure. The baby kicked sharply, making Ellen gasp. She pressed both hands to her belly, feeling the fierce movement beneath her palms. "You think it wasn't an accident?" "I know it wasn't." Ramsey turned from the window, his eyes burning with old rage. "My father's people were thorough. They always are." A chill ran down Ellen's spine that had nothing to do with the cold marble. "Your father knows about you now." The words fell between them like broken glass. About the baby. About us. The room seemed to contract around them. Ellen felt the walls pressing closer, the air growing thin. "How?" "My assistant. She's been reporting to him for months. Every meeting, every decision, every moment of weakness." His laugh was bitter and hollow. "I should have known. Nothing happens in my life that he doesn't orchestrate. Then we leave." The words tumbled out before Aylin could stop them. "Tonight. We disappear, go somewhere he can't reach us." "There is nowhere he can't reach." Ramsey moved toward her, his hands cupping her face with desperate gentleness. "Don't you understand? This is why I've lived the way I have, why I've never let anyone close. Everyone I care about becomes a weapon he can use against me." "I'm not Marcus," Aylin said fiercely. "I'm not some naive idealist who thinks the world can be saved with good intentions. I've lived on the streets, Ramsey. I know how to survive, not against him, not against what he's capable of." The baby kicked again, harder this time, as if responding to the tension crackling between them. Ellen pressed Ramsey's hand to her belly, letting him feel the strong, determined movements. "This child deserves better than a father who's already given up," she whispered. "Marcus chose to fight, knowing the risks. Maybe it's time you made the same choice." Something shifted in Ramsey's expression, a flicker of the man she'd glimpsed beneath the ruthless exterior. His fingers spread across her belly, following the baby's restless movements. "He's meeting with the board tomorrow," he said quietly. "Emergency session. He's going to have me removed as CEO, claim I'm mentally unstable, that my relationship with an employee proves I'm unfit to lead. Let him try. Ellen's voice carried a steel she didn't know she possessed. We have something he doesn't expect. What's that? Nothing left to lose. She pulled back to meet his eyes. You've spent your whole life protecting an empire built on blood and lies. What if we tore it down instead? The silence stretched between them, filled only by the rain's relentless percussion against the windows. When Ramsay finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. It would be a war. Then we fight. Ellen stepped closer, her body pressed against his, the baby moving between them like a promise of the future they could build from the ashes of the past, together. Outside, lightning split the sky, illuminating the city below in stark, electric detail. In that moment, Ellen saw their path clearly. Dangerous, uncertain, but leading towards something that might finally resemble freedom. The rain hammered against the windows of Ramsay's penthouse as Ellen paced the marble floor, her bare feet making soft sounds that echoed in the vast space. 3 days had passed since Marcus's veiled threat, and the weight of unspoken truths pressed down on her like a physical force. She pressed her palms against her growing belly, feeling the flutter of movement within, a reminder that time was running out. Ramsay emerged from his study, his shirt unbuttoned and sleeves rolled up, papers clutched in his white-knuckled grip. The documents bore the letterhead of Crawford Investigations, and Ellen's heart lurched when she recognized the name. Marcus hadn't been bluffing. "We need to talk," Ramsay said, his voice strained. He set the papers on the glass coffee table between them like evidence in a trial. Ellen's breath caught as she saw her own photograph clipped to the corner of the first page, not recent, but from years ago. Younger, different hair, a different name printed beneath, Elena Castellano. "How long have you known?" she whispered. "Since yesterday." Ramsay's jaw tightened. "Marcus delivered this personally. He seems to think your past gives him leverage over both of us." She sank onto the leather sofa, her legs suddenly unable to support her. The carefully constructed walls she'd built around her new identity crumbled with each word printed on those pages. Elena Castellano, daughter of Vincent Castellano, the mob accountant who disappeared with $15 million and left a trail of bodies in his wake. "My father destroyed everything," Ellen said, her voice barely audible. "When he vanished, they came for our family, my mother, my brother." She closed her eyes, the memories flooding back. "I was 19 when I changed my name, moved across the country. I thought I'd buried Elena forever." Ramsay moved to the window, his reflection ghostly in the rain-streaked glass. "The report says the money was never recovered, that certain parties are still looking for it. Because they think I know where it is." Ellen's laugh held no humor. "They've been hunting me for 8 years, and I can't tell them what I don't know. My father never trusted anyone, not even his own daughter. But Marcus thinks differently." She looked up sharply. "What did he say to you?" Ramsay turned, his grey eyes turbulent as the storm outside. "He offered me a choice: help him get information from you, or watch both our careers burn when he releases this to the media. A pregnant mob princess working under a false identity at Sterling Industries. The board would crucify us both." The baby kicked, as if responding to the tension in the room. Ellen placed a protective hand over the spot, her mind racing. She'd been naive to think Marcus would simply disappear after that night at the restaurant. Men like him never gave up when they smelled weakness. "There's something else," Ramsay continued, his voice growing quieter. "Something the report doesn't mention, but Marcus does." Ellen's pulse quickened. "What?" "Your brother." Daniel Ramsay's eyes met hers. "He's alive." The world tilted. Ellen gripped the arm of the sofa, her vision blurring. "That's impossible." "They told me," the police said. "Marcus has proof. Photos, surveillance footage. Daniel's been living in Chicago under the name David Chen. He's been looking for you." Tears spilled down her cheeks as 8 years of grief and guilt crashed over her. She'd blamed herself for leaving Daniel behind, for not trying harder to find him. The weight of that assumed loss had shaped every decision she'd made since. "Why would Marcus tell us this?" she managed to ask. Ramsey's expression darkened. "Because he has Daniel, and he's using him as insurance to make sure we cooperate." The cruelty of it stole her breath. Marcus had weaponized her deepest wound, the brother she'd mourned and the money she'd never seen. He held all the cards while she and Ramsey scrambled to protect what little they'd built together. "He wants a meeting," Ramsey said. "Tomorrow night. Just you and him." "No," Ramsey's voice cut through the air like a blade. "I won't let you face him alone." Ellen stood unsteadily, her mind made up despite the fear coursing through her veins. "He won't hurt me, not when he thinks I'm valuable. But he'll destroy Daniel just to prove he can, and he'll ruin you because you chose to protect me instead of your precious company. Ellen, I'm going to end this." She moved to him, placing her palm against his chest where his heart hammered against his ribs. "Whatever happens tomorrow night, I need you to promise me something." He covered her hand with his own. "Anything. If something goes wrong, if Marcus," she swallowed hard, "take care of our baby. Give them the life I never had, the kind where they don't have to run from shadows or live under borrowed names." Ramsey pulled her against him, his arms a fortress against the storm both outside and within. But even his strength couldn't shield them from the reckoning that awaited in Marcus's carefully laid trap. The rain hammered against the penthouse windows as Ramsey paced the length of his office, his phone pressed to his ear. The conversation with his security team had been brief but devastating. Someone had been asking questions about Ellen, digging into records that should have remained buried. "Sir, the inquiry came from a private investigator," Marcus reported through the speaker. "We traced it back to Victoria Ashford." Ramsey's blood turned to ice. Victoria, his stepmother, the woman who had orchestrated his father's final years and controlled the family fortune until Ramsey had wrestled it away. She had been silent for months, licking her wounds after their last corporate battle, but apparently she hadn't been idle. "What does she know?" he asked, his voice deadly calm. Unclear, but the PI was specifically looking into Miss Castellanos's background, her financial situation, and— Marcus hesitated. "Her pregnancy timeline, sir." The phone slipped from Ramsey's fingers, clattering onto his desk. Victoria couldn't know about Ellen's connection to him, not the real one. If she discovered that Ellen was carrying his child, she would use it as ammunition to destroy everything he had built. But if she uncovered the deeper truth, the one that connected them long before that night 6 months ago— His office door burst open without warning. Ellen stood in the doorway, her face pale and her chest rising and falling rapidly, as if she had run the entire way up 30 floors. "Someone broke into my apartment," she said, her voice shaking. "They didn't take anything valuable, but my personal documents were scattered everywhere. Birth certificates, old photographs, my mother's papers." "When?" Ramsey was already moving toward her, his hands instinctively reaching for her shoulders. "Last night, while I was at the doctor's appointment you insisted I keep." Her eyes searched his face. "Ramsey, what's happening? This isn't random, is it?" Before he could answer, his desk phone rang. Victoria's name flashed on the caller ID like a death sentence. Ramsey looked at Ellen, then at the phone, weighing his options. He could ignore it, but Victoria wasn't the type to give up easily. "Don't answer it," Ellen whispered, somehow understanding the gravity of the moment. But it was too late. The phone had already connected to the speaker system, and Victoria's honeyed voice filled the room like poison. "Hello, darling stepson. I hope I'm not interrupting anything important." Ramsey's jaw clenched. "What do you want, Victoria?" Such hostility. "I simply wanted to congratulate you on your upcoming addition to the family. Though I must say I'm surprised you chose someone so connected to your past." Ellen's face went white, and Ramsey felt the world tilt beneath his feet. Victoria knew. Somehow, impossibly, she had pieced it together. "I have no idea what you're talking about," he said carefully. Victoria's laugh was like breaking glass. Oh, but you do. Elena Castellanos, daughter of Maria Castellanos, who worked so faithfully for your dear departed father. The same Maria who cleaned your childhood bedroom, who brought her daughter to work when she couldn't find a babysitter. The same little girl you used to play with in the servants' quarters. Ellen staggered backward as if physically struck, her eyes locked onto Ramsey's face, searching for a denial that never came. The silence stretched between them, heavy with 20 years of separation and lies. You remember now, don't you, Elena? Victoria continued sweetly. Though you were so much younger then. 8 years old, wasn't it? When your mother was so tragically killed in that car accident? Stop, Ramsey said, his voice low and dangerous. But here's the truly fascinating part, Victoria pressed on. That accident happened just days after she discovered something she shouldn't have about dear old Dad's business dealings. Such terrible timing. Ellen's hand flew to her mouth, and Ramsey saw the moment when the final pieces clicked into place for her. The understanding that her mother's death might not have been an accident. The realization that he had known who she was from the moment she walked into his building, hungry and desperate. You knew, she whispered, her voice breaking. All this time you knew who I was. Elena, did you know about my mother? Did you know what really happened to her? Victoria's voice cut through their confrontation like a blade. Such touching reunions aside, I have a proposition for you both. Meet me tomorrow at the Ashford estate. Come alone, and come prepared to discuss the future of your little family. Because if you don't, I'll make sure the world knows exactly what kind of empire you've built on the bones of dead servants. The line went dead, leaving them in suffocating silence. Ellen wrapped her arms around her stomach protectively, tears streaming down her face as she stared at the man she thought she was beginning to trust. 20 years, she said, her voice barely audible. 20 years I've wondered who I was, where I came from. And you knew. The underground parking garage felt like a concrete tomb as Ellen made her way toward her car, each footstep echoing in the empty space. She'd stayed late again, hoping to avoid the curious stares and whispered conversations that had become her constant companions since word of her relationship with Ramsey had leaked through the office. Her phone buzzed with another text from him. "Where are you? We need to talk." She ignored it, just as she'd ignored the previous 5 messages, the weight of everything, the pregnancy, the media attention, the investigation into Malcolm's embezzlement, and now the growing pressure from the board pressed down on her shoulders like a physical force. The click of expensive shoes on concrete made her freeze. She knew that sound, had memorized the rhythm of those confident strides during countless late nights when he'd pace his office while dictating emails. Running away won't solve anything. Ramsey's voice carried across the empty garage, rough with exhaustion. Ellen didn't turn around. "I'm not running. I'm surviving. By shutting me out?" She finally faced him, noting the wrinkled shirt, the loosened tie, the shadow of stubble across his jaw. When was the last time she'd seen him anything less than perfectly composed? "By protecting what's left of my career, my reputation, my future, our future." The words hung between them like a challenge. Ellen felt the familiar flutter in her abdomen, stronger now at 20 weeks, and instinctively placed a protective hand over her growing belly. "Do you know what happened today?" she asked, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands. "Jenkins from accounting asked me if I was carrying the golden ticket. 3 separate people congratulated me on landing the big fish. And HR wants to meet with me tomorrow about potential conflicts of interest." Ramsey stepped closer, and she saw something she'd never seen in his eyes before: uncertainty. "I'll handle HR. I'll handle all of it." "Like you handled the board meeting this afternoon?" His jaw tightened. "You heard about that?" The whole building heard Marcus Thornfield shouting about moral turpitude and compromised leadership. "Your own board, Ramsey. They're questioning your judgment. Let them question. I've built this company from nothing. They can't." "They can." The words came out sharper than she intended. "They absolutely can. And when they do, where does that leave me? Where does that leave our baby?" For a moment, The only sound was the distant hum of the building's ventilation system. Ramsay ran a hand through his hair, destroying what remained of his usually perfect styling. "I never wanted this," he said quietly. "The complications, the scrutiny. I wanted to keep you safe from all of it. Then you should have left me in the cafeteria that day." The words hit him like a physical blow. She saw it in the way his shoulders tensed, the way his breathing changed. "Don't," he said, his voice dangerous. "Don't ever suggest I should have walked away." "Why?" The question burst out of her with all the frustration and confusion of the past months. "Because of some misplaced sense of responsibility? Because you felt sorry for the pregnant girl eating garbage? Or because the first love you?" The declaration stopped her mid-sentence. He'd never said it before, not directly, not like this. Even in their most intimate moments, the words had remained unspoken, a truth too dangerous to acknowledge. "You love the idea of saving me," she corrected, fighting against the hope blooming in her chest. "You love being the hero in this story. You think this is about my ego?" He moved closer, close enough that she could smell his cologne, could see the gold flecks in his dark eyes. "You think I'm putting everything I've built at risk for some savior complex? I think you're a man who's used to getting what he wants, and right now you want to play house with the convenient redemption story." The slap of her words seemed to echo in the concrete space. For a long moment they stared at each other, years of unspoken history and unacknowledged pain crackling between them. "Convenient," he repeated, his voice soft and deadly. "Is that what you think this is?" Before she could respond, he pulled out his phone and opened what looked like a news article. He held the screen toward her, and her heart stopped. The headline read, "Blackwood Industries CEO faces hostile takeover amid personal scandal." "Thornfield made his move this morning," Ramsay said, his voice hollow. "He's got backing from 3 other board members and 2 major investors. By Friday, there's a good chance I'll be voted out of my own company." Ellen stared at the screen, the words blurring as tears filled her eyes. "Ramsay, I still think this is convenient for me." The question hung in the air as her phone rang, Marcus Thornfield's name flashing on the screen. They both stared at it, understanding instinctively that whatever he wanted, it would change everything. The hospital room felt smaller with each passing hour. Ellen shifted uncomfortably in the narrow bed, her hand instinctively moving to her belly where the baby kicked restlessly, as if sensing the tension that had consumed their world. 3 days had passed since Marcus's arrest, and the silence from Ramsay was deafening. She'd expected him to visit, to call, to send some word. Instead, there was nothing but the steady stream of nurses checking her vitals and the occasional visit from Detective Morrison, whose questions grew more pointed with each encounter. The media circus outside had only intensified, with reporters camping in the parking lot, desperate for any glimpse of the woman at the center of the Thornfield Industries scandal. The door opened quietly, and Ellen's heart leaped, hoping to see Ramsay's familiar silhouette. Instead, Sarah Chen stepped inside, her usually pristine appearance showing signs of strain. Dark circles shadowed her eyes, and her typically perfect hair was pulled back in a messy bun. "How are you feeling?" Sarah asked, settling into the uncomfortable visitor's chair. "Like I'm living in someone else's nightmare," Ellen replied honestly. "Where is he, Sarah? Why hasn't he come?" Sarah's expression grew troubled. "He's dealing with the fallout. The board called an emergency meeting yesterday. There are calls for his resignation, investigations into every contract the company has signed in the past 5 years. The Marcus situation has opened doors that some people would prefer remained closed." "But I need him here," Ellen whispered, her voice breaking. The baby needs you to stay calm and healthy," Sarah interrupted gently. "And Ramsay is trying to protect you both. The less visible connection there appears to be between you two right now, the better. The investigators are looking for any leverage they can find." Through the window, Ellen could see news vans lined up like vultures. "I never wanted this, any of this. I just wanted a job, a chance to provide for my baby." "I know." Sarah reached over and squeezed her hand. But there's something else you need to know, something Ramsay should have told you himself, but given the circumstances, Aylin's stomach clenched. What? Marcus didn't just stumble onto information about you and Ramsay. Someone fed it to him. Someone with access to security footage, employee records, financial transactions, someone inside the company. The revelation hit Aylin like a physical blow. Who? We don't know yet. But whoever it is, they're still out there, still watching, still waiting. Sarah's voice dropped to barely above a whisper. Ramsay thinks the distance will keep you safe, but I'm not so sure. These people, whoever they are, they're playing a long game. A soft knock interrupted them, and both women tensed. But it was only Dr. Martinez, clipboard in hand, wearing the kind of expression that immediately set Ellen on edge. Ms. Chen, I need to speak with Ms. Harper privately, the doctor said. Sarah hesitated, glancing between them. I'll be right outside, she promised, squeezing Ellen's hand once more before leaving. Dr. Martinez closed the door and moved to the foot of the bed. Your latest blood work shows elevated stress hormones, and the baby's heart rate has been irregular. I'm concerned about the impact this situation is having on your pregnancy. I'm trying to stay calm, Ellen said weakly. I know you are, but stress like this, it's not just psychological, it's physiological. Your body is in constant fight or flight mode, and that's dangerous for both you and the baby. The doctor's tone grew firm. I need to ask you directly, is there somewhere else you can go, somewhere away from all this? Ellen stared at her hands. I don't have anywhere else. What about the baby's father? Could he? He's the reason I'm in this situation, Ellen said bitterly, then immediately felt guilty. None of this was really Ramsay's fault, but his absence felt like abandonment when she needed him most. Dr. Martinez made a note on her chart. I'm going to recommend another night of observation, but after that, you need to seriously consider removing yourself from this environment. The pregnancy is still high risk, and the stress could trigger early labor or other complications. After the doctor left, Ellen lay back against the pillows, feeling more alone than she had since those first terrifying weeks, when she'd realized she was pregnant and unemployed. The baby shifted inside her, a reminder that she wasn't just making decisions for herself anymore. Her phone buzzed with a text message, and her heart raced when she saw it was from an unknown number. But as she read the words, her blood turned to ice. Some secrets are worth killing for, others are worth dying for. Choose wisely. The phone slipped from her trembling fingers, clattering to the floor as the machine monitoring her heart rate began to beep frantically. Through the window, she caught a glimpse of a figure in a dark coat walking calmly away from the hospital, disappearing into the crowd of reporters like a ghost. The hospital room felt smaller than it had hours ago, the weight of Marcus' confession still hanging between them like a physical presence. Ellen sat on the edge of the bed, her hand unconsciously resting on her belly where their child grew, while Marcus paced near the window, his usual commanding presence diminished by exhaustion and raw emotion. Your father knew about us, she said quietly, breaking the silence that had stretched too long, about what we were to each other before. Marcus stopped pacing, his shoulders tensing. He knew everything. He always did. That's how he maintained control. Information was his weapon of choice. The machines around them beeped steadily, a mechanical rhythm that seemed to mark the seconds of their shared reckoning. Ellen thought about the man she'd worked for, the CEO who had hired her personally, who had sometimes looked at her with an expression she'd never quite understood. Now it made terrible sense. The promotion to your floor, she continued, pieces falling into place with sickening clarity. He arranged it, didn't he? He wanted us to find each other again. A test, Marcus confirmed, his voice bitter. He was dying, and he needed to know if I could be trusted with the company's real secrets. If seeing you again would make me weak, or if it would finally teach me what he considered strength. Ellen felt a chill that had nothing to do with the hospital's air conditioning. What kind of secrets? Marcus finally turned to face her, his grey eyes dark with something that looked like fear. "The Blackwood Group isn't just a corporation, Elin. It's a front. Has been for 30 years. We launder money for people who make problems disappear, who traffic in things that shouldn't exist, who buy and sell influence at the highest levels of government." The words hit her like physical blows. She thought of the late nights she'd spent organizing Marcus's calendar, the meetings with men in expensive suits who never seemed to have last names, the financial reports that never quite added up in ways she'd convinced herself were above her understanding. The restaurant chains, the real estate holdings, the tech investments, it's all designed to clean dirty money and provide legitimate cover for illegitimate activities. Marcus's voice was mechanical now, as if he were reading from a script he'd memorized against his will. "I've been running the legitimate side, but I knew. God help me, I've always known." Ellen's hand tightened protectively over her stomach. "And your father's death wasn't natural." The admission seemed to tear something loose in Marcus's chest. He was going to expose everything, turn state's evidence. He'd decided that his legacy shouldn't be built on blood money. Someone decided that his conscience had become a liability. The room seemed to tilt around them. Ellen gripped the bed rail, her knuckles white. "You think they killed him?" "I know they did. And now they're watching to see what I'll do, whether I'll honor the old agreements or follow his example." Marcus moved closer, his hand reaching toward her before falling back to his side. "That's why I've been so careful around you, why I tried to keep my distance. They use leverage, Elin. They find what matters most to someone and they make it a weapon. Like a pregnant woman," she whispered, understanding flooding through her with crystal clarity, like an unborn child. The fear in Marcus's eyes confirmed what she already knew. She was no longer just an employee who'd discovered an inconvenient truth. She was evidence of Marcus's vulnerability, proof that he could be controlled. "There's something else," Marcus said, his voice barely audible. "The reason you were really hired, why my father chose you specifically." Ellen waited, though part of her didn't want to hear what came next. "Your background check revealed something that most people don't know, something that's been buried in sealed records since you were 18. Marcus's hands were shaking now. "Your father didn't die in an accident, Ellen. He was an investigative journalist, and he was getting too close to exposing a network of corporate corruption. The same network that my father was part of." The breath left her lungs in a rush. Her father, who had taught her to love books and question everything, who had died when she was barely old enough to understand what loss meant. "He had a daughter," Marcus continued, "and that daughter grew up to be exactly the kind of person who could be useful to the right people. Smart, overlooked, desperate enough to be grateful for opportunities that seemed too good to be true." Ellen felt something break apart inside her chest, a grief she'd thought she'd finished mourning mixing with a rage that tasted like copper on her tongue. "They've been watching me my whole life," she said, the words emerging with deadly quiet certainty. Marcus nodded, and in his eyes she saw the reflection of her own terrible understanding. They weren't just lovers, or business associates, or two people trying to build something real from the wreckage of their past. They were both prisoners in a game that had started before they'd ever met. Players on a board controlled by people who saw human lives as nothing more than pieces to be moved and sacrificed. The boardroom felt like a tomb as Ramsay faced the 11 members of the board of directors, their faces ranging from curious to openly hostile. Margaret Chen, the board chair, sat at the far end of the polished table, her fingers steepled as she studied him with calculating eyes. "The allegations are serious, Ramsay," she began, her voice cutting through the tension. "Misappropriation of company funds, unauthorized personnel decisions, and what some are calling highly inappropriate conduct with an employee." Ramsay's jaw tightened. He'd expected this moment ever since Victor Hawthorne had cornered him 3 days ago, demanding answers about the sudden changes in his behavior, the unexplained expenses, the protection he'd extended to Aylin. Someone had been watching, documenting, building a case. "I assume you have evidence to support these accusations," he said, his voice steady despite the storm raging inside him. Richard Pemberton, Victor's closest ally on the board, slid a thick folder across the table. Security footage of you entering Miss Santos's apartment building multiple times. Financial records showing company funds used for her medical expenses. Witness statements about your personal interest in her welfare. The words hit like physical blows, but Ramsey forced himself to remain impassive. He couldn't let them see how deeply they'd cut, how accurately they'd pieced together his carefully hidden actions. "And what exactly do you believe this proves?" he asked. "That you've compromised your position as CEO," Margaret replied. "That your judgment has become clouded by an inappropriate relationship that puts the company at risk." Through the floor-to-ceiling windows, Ramsey could see the city sprawling below, the empire he'd built through years of ruthless determination and sacrifice. Everything he'd worked for balanced on a knife's edge, and the irony wasn't lost on him that it might crumble not because of a business failure, but because he'd finally learned to care about someone other than himself. "There's more," Richard continued, producing another document. "Miss Santos has been asking questions about company policies, specifically regarding pregnancy discrimination and hostile work environments. Some might see this as preparation for a lawsuit, possibly with your assistance." The accusation was so far from the truth, it would have been laughable if the stakes weren't so high. Ellen had no idea about the legal minefield surrounding their situation, had never even hinted at wanting to use her condition for any kind of advantage. "You're grasping at shadows," Ramsey said. "Ellen Santos is a dedicated employee who's been going through personal difficulties. I've provided support within appropriate channels." "Appropriate channels don't typically involve the CEO personally ensuring an employee's rent is paid," Margaret observed, "or arranging for private medical consultations, or spending hours at her apartment." Each revelation felt like another nail in his coffin. They'd been thorough, building their case while he'd been focused on protecting Ellen and navigating the emotional earthquake of discovering their connection. He'd underestimated his enemies, let his guard down when he could least afford to. "I want to know about the real reason for your interest in Miss Santos." Victor spoke for the first time, his voice carrying a dangerous edge. "Because our investigation has uncovered some interesting information about her background. Her real name, for instance." Ramsey's blood turned to ice. If they'd discovered Ellen's true identity, if they knew about Sarah and the connection between them, everything would unravel. Not just his career, but the carefully constructed walls he'd built around his past. "I'm not sure what you're implying," he managed. "Elena Castellanos," Victor said, savoring each syllable. "Daughter of the late Dr. Miguel Castellanos, who worked at St. Mary's Hospital 15 years ago. The same hospital where a certain young woman named Sarah McKinnon died in the emergency room." The room tilted around Ramsey. They knew. Somehow they'd uncovered the connection he'd fought so hard to bury, the guilt that had shaped every decision he'd made since that terrible night. "Sarah McKinnon," Margaret repeated thoughtfully. "Your girlfriend at the time, wasn't she? The one who died while you were—" She consulted her notes, celebrating a business victory, unreachable when she needed you most. "This is ancient history," Ramsey said, but his voice sounded hollow even to his own ears. "Ancient history that explains why you'd risk everything for the daughter of the doctor who couldn't save her," Richard added. "Guilt makes people do foolish things, Ramsey. It clouds judgment, leads to poor decisions. Like allowing yourself to be manipulated by someone who might blame you for her father's disgrace," Victor concluded. "Dr. Castellanos left the hospital shortly after Sarah McKinnon's death, didn't he? Moved his family away. One might wonder what his daughter really wants from you." The web of implications tightened around him, each thread connecting past trauma to present vulnerability. They'd turned his deepest secret into a weapon, twisted his connection to Ellen into something dark and manipulative. But they didn't know the whole truth. They didn't know Ellen was carrying his child. The boardroom felt like a tomb as Ramsey sat across from his father, the silence stretching between them like a chasm 20 years in the making. Harold Blackwood's weathered hands rested on the polished mahogany table, his steel-grey eyes never leaving his son's face. "You've put us in an impossible position," Harold said finally, his voice carrying the weight of disappointment that had haunted Ramsay since childhood. "The board is calling for your resignation. The shareholders are in revolt. And now I discover you've been hiding this woman and her child." Ramsay's jaw tightened. "Her name is Ellen, and she's not just some woman, isn't she?" Harold leaned forward, his expression hardening. "A pregnant employee living in squalor, eating garbage in our cafeteria? Do you have any idea what this looks like, what it could cost us?" "I know exactly what it looks like," Ramsay shot back, rising from his chair. "It looks like I finally found something more important than your goddamn empire." The words hung in the air like a challenge. Harold's face darkened, the familiar storm clouds gathering in his features that Ramsay remembered from countless childhood confrontations. "Everything you have, everything you are, you owe to this company," Harold said, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. "I won't let you destroy it for some misguided notion of love," Ramsay finished. "Is that what you can't bring yourself to say? That your son might actually be capable of loving someone?" Harold stood slowly, his imposing frame casting a shadow across the table. "Love is a luxury we can't afford. Not in this business, not in this family." Ramsay thought of Aylin, probably at that moment sitting in the hospital room where they'd moved her for monitoring after her collapse yesterday. The doctors said stress could trigger premature labor, and the guilt that knowledge brought was eating him alive. She was suffering because of him, because of the world he'd dragged her into. "Then maybe I don't want to be part of this family anymore," he said quietly. The slap came swift and sharp, Harold's palm connecting with Ramsay's cheek with a crack that echoed through the room. It was the first time his father had struck him since he was 12, but the sting of it felt exactly the same. "You ungrateful," Harold began, but his words were cut short by the boardroom door opening. Margaret Chen, the company's head of legal, stepped inside, her usually composed demeanor visibly shaken. "Mr. Blackwood, I'm sorry to interrupt, but we have a problem. A big one." Ramsay touched his cheek, still feeling the burn of his father's hand. "What kind of problem?" "The whistleblower story just broke," Margaret said, her voice tight with anxiety. "Someone leaked everything about the accounting irregularities, the offshore accounts, the tax evasion schemes. It's all over the financial networks." Harold's face went ashen. "That's impossible. Only a handful of people had access to that information." "There's more," Margaret continued, glancing between father and son. "The leak came with insider documentation that could only have been provided by someone with executive-level access. The FBI is already mobilizing a task force." Ramsay felt the blood drain from his face. The timing was too convenient, too perfect. Someone had been waiting for exactly this moment, when he was most vulnerable, most distracted, to strike. "Who?" he demanded. "Who had that kind of access?" Before Margaret could answer, the boardroom's wall-mounted television flickered to life, tuned to the financial news. Ramsay's stomach dropped as he saw the headline crawling across the bottom of the screen: "Blackwood Industries under federal investigation, CEO's secret affair exposed." But it was the face on the screen that made his blood run cold. Not his own face or his father's, but Aylin's. A photo of her leaving his apartment building, clearly taken from a distance with a telephoto lens. The source also provided evidence of CEO Ramsay Blackwood's affair with employee Ellen Morrison, the news anchor was saying, including documentation that suggests the relationship may have been used to cover up financial crimes. "No," Ramsay breathed, reaching for his phone. He dialed Ellen's number with trembling fingers, but it went straight to voicemail. He tried the hospital, but the nurse said she'd checked herself out an hour ago, against medical advice. "You need to find her," Margaret said urgently. "If the FBI thinks she's involved, if they think she was helping you hide assets or manipulate records." Ramsay was already moving toward the door, but Harold's voice stopped him. "If you walk out of here now," his father said, each word deliberate and final, "don't come back. You'll have nothing. No company, no inheritance, no family, nothing." Ramsay paused at the threshold, his hand on the door handle. Through the floor-to-ceiling windows, he could see the city sprawling below, the empire his family had built brick by brick over 3 generations, everything he'd ever known, ever worked for, ever been. Then he thought of Ellen's smile, of the child she carried, of the life they could build together away from all this poison. He turned the handle and walked out. The helicopter blades cut through the morning air as Ramsey gripped Ellen's hand, watching the city shrink below them. 24 hours had passed since Marcus's arrest, since the FBI had raided Blackstone Industries, since their world had turned upside down. The emergency custody order sat folded in his jacket pocket, a legal shield that would keep them safe while the investigation unfolded. "Where are we going?" Ellen asked, her voice barely audible over the rotor noise. "Somewhere Marcus can't reach us," Ramsey replied, pressing his lips to her knuckles. "Somewhere we can figure out what comes next." The pilot's voice crackled through their headsets. "Landing in 5 minutes, sir." Below them, a private estate emerged from rolling hills. Victorian architecture sprawled across manicured grounds, gardens blooming despite the season. Ellen's eyes widened as they descended toward the landing pad. "This was my grandmother's place," Ramsey explained as they touched down. "The only property Marcus never knew about. She left it to me in a trust he couldn't access." The house smelled of lavender and old books, dust motes dancing in shafts of sunlight streaming through tall windows. Ellen moved through the rooms like someone in a dream, her fingers trailing along antique furniture, oil paintings, a life that seemed impossibly removed from the chaos they'd left behind. "Ramsey," she said, stopping before a portrait hanging in the main hallway. A young woman with familiar dark eyes smiled down at them, holding a baby. "Is this my grandmother holding my father?" His voice grew soft, "before Marcus destroyed everything good in our family." Ellen turned to face him, her hands cradling her growing belly. At 5 months, their daughter made her presence known with gentle kicks that still amazed him. "What did the lawyers say this morning?" Ramsey pulled out his phone, scrolling through the messages that had arrived during their flight. "The FBI found everything: financial records, forged documents, evidence of the bribes he paid to cover up the adoption fraud. Marcus won't see the outside of a prison cell for the next 20 years. Relief flooded Ellen's features, but uncertainty lingered. And Blackstone Industries? The board voted this morning. Emergency succession plan activated. A smile tugged at his lips. Apparently, being the victim of corporate espionage and attempted murder makes you a sympathetic figure. They want me back as CEO. Do you want to go back? The question hung between them, like a bridge waiting to be crossed. Ramsey looked around the peaceful room, at the woman carrying his child, at the life they could build away from the cutthroat world that had nearly destroyed them both. "I want our daughter to know her father," he said finally. "Not the man the media created, not the ruthless CEO everyone feared, just me." Ellen moved closer, her hands finding his face. "Then show me who you really are." That evening, they sat on the back terrace, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of gold and crimson. Ramsey had shed his suit for jeans and a sweater, looking younger somehow, the sharp edges of his corporate persona softened by the peaceful surroundings. "I used to come here every summer as a child," he said, sharing stories Ellen had never heard. "My grandmother taught me to garden, to cook, to find joy in simple things. Marcus hated it, said it was making me soft." "Maybe that's exactly what you needed," Ellen replied, leaning against his shoulder. "To remember that being human isn't a weakness." His phone buzzed with another message. Agent Chen, updating them on the investigation's progress. More arrests were coming. Board members who had helped Marcus, officials who had taken bribes, a network of corruption that reached deeper than anyone had imagined. "There's something else," Ramsey said, his voice growing serious. "The lawyers found paperwork about your adoption. Your birth mother. She tried to keep you. Marcus paid the social worker to falsify the abandonment claim." Tears spilled down Ellen's cheeks, but they weren't entirely sad. She wanted me. She fought for you until the day she died. Cancer, when you were 3, but she never stopped hoping she'd see you again. They held each other as darkness fell, processing the weight of revelations that reframed their entire understanding of the past. Their daughter kicked between them, a reminder that whatever had been broken could still be healed. "What do we do now?" Elen whispered. Ramsay looked up at the stars beginning to emerge in the clear country sky, thinking of boardrooms and corporate battles, of the empire that bore his name. Then he looked at Ellen, at the future growing within her, at the chance for redemption he'd never thought possible. "We build something better," he said, "starting with our family." In the morning, they would face lawyers and reporters, decisions about Blackstone's future and their own. But tonight, they were simply two people who had found their way back to each other, ready to write a different ending to their story.